Welcome to the story of one of the most disturbing cases in the history of the Tennessee mountains. Before we start, please leave a comment about where you are and when you heard this story. We want to know where these documented accounts come from and when they come in. In the fall of 1898, the small town of Elhorn Valley, which is deep in the eastern Tennessee mountains, became the center of a case that would puzzle law enforcement for decades. This small settlement of no more than 50 people lived in relative harmony with the harsh mountain environment. It was located about 30 miles from Knoxville, in the Appalachian Range, where there are dense forests and rough terrain. That is, until Ezekiel Blackwood, a reclusive trapper who lived in a cabin on Widow's Ridge, started acting strangely. In 1898, the Tennessee mountains were one of the last truly wild places in the eastern United States. The Appalachian communities were more isolated than the more developed areas to the north and the plantation economies to the south. They were governed more by tradition and necessity than by the quickly changing laws of the country. The Industrial Revolution had hardly any effect on these remote valleys, where families still lived much like their ancestors did 100 years ago. Life's rhythms changed with the seasons. Harsh winters drove people inside, while short, lively summers brought people together and allowed for trade. The first settlers in the 1822nd named Elhorn Valley after the unusually large elk antlers they found there. By the time of our story, however, the elk had been hunted to extinction in the area. There were about 15 homes in the settlement, which were spread out along a narrow valley floor. In the middle of the settlement was a small area with a general store, a one-room schoolhouse, and a simple church made of local wood. Jefferson City was the closest railroad station, but it took a full day to get there by horse. This meant that supplies came less often, and news from the outside world came even less often. Most of the people who lived in Elhorn Valley were of Scots-Irish descent, but a few families could trace their roots back to German immigrants who had moved west after coming to Pennsylvania. They were tough people who were wary of outsiders, but fiercely loyal to their own. Most families were able to stay alive by farming, hunting, and raising small amounts of livestock. More skilled hunters and trappers, like Ezekiel Blackwood, could make a little money by selling furs and game to traders who would then take these goods to bigger markets in Knoxville and other places. According to the few records kept by the local trading post, Ezekiel had settled in the area by 1883. He didn't talk much and wasn't very polite. Every 3 weeks, he would come down from the mountains to trade furs and buy supplies. Thomas Weller, the local storekeeper, wrote in his ledger that Ezekiel's furs were always of the best quality. He was able to get an unusual number of black bear pelts, even when other trappers came back empty-handed. The East Tennessee Historical Society has Weller's ledger, which is one of the few reliable records of Blackwood's life. The entries go from October 1883 to September 1898 and show not only the things Blackwood traded, but also Weller's personal thoughts from time to time. One entry from February 1887 says, "Blackwood arrived today despite 3 feet of snow on the high passes. He brought 4 prime bear pelts and a dozen rabbit furs, asked for unusual amounts of salt and coffee, and said something about preparations being underway. When asked, he became quiet and paid in full with gold coins from Spain. He still refuses to give credit, even though he promised to do so in good faith." Records from the county at the time say that Ezekiel was about 45 years old, stood over 6 feet tall, and had a body that had become strong from living in the mountains for so long. According to many reports, his beard came close to his waist, and his eyes were often said to be unnaturally pale, though this detail changes from source to source. The one thing that all the stories have in common is that Ezekiel spoke with an accent that made it clear he was not from Tennessee, but no one could figure out where it came from. The most accurate account comes from Dr. James Hollister, a doctor who was passing through the area in 1897. He wrote in his journal, "Encountered a most singular individual at the trading post today. The man's posture suggested military training, yet his manner was entirely wild. Despite his rough exterior, his speech, when he chose to employ it, revealed education inconsistent with his present circumstances. When I inquired as to his previous residence, he fixed me with a gaze so intense I found myself instinctively stepping backward. The proprietor later informed me this was the infamous mountain man who supplies the area with game. I cannot help but wonder what circumstances led such a clearly educated individual to this remote existence. Dr. Hollister's journal, which was found during a university archive cataloging in 1952, goes on to talk about a strange interaction he saw between Blackwood and a young man from one of the local families. The mountain man's demeanor changed a lot when a local boy, Samuel Collins, approached him. Collins asked about how to set traps, and to my surprise, Blackwood patiently explained the habits of different forest animals and how their patterns might be predicted. There was something in the way he spoke, a certain clinical precision that reminded me of my medical professors at university. He talked about animal behavior not as a woodsman with practical knowledge, but as a naturalist with scientific interest. When Collins thanked him and left, Blackwood's eyes followed him with an expression that made me uneasy, though I couldn't say exactly why. This account is especially important because Samuel Collins would later be one of the guides during the search for the missing hunters, and his knowledge of Blackwood's territory would be very helpful to the investigation. People were interested in Ezekiel for 15 years, but they weren't worried about him. The families in the area learned to stay away from his land and told their kids not to go too close to Widow's Ridge. People mostly respected this unofficial line, but hunters sometimes crossed it when they were looking for game. People in the area say that Blackwood would sometimes silently show up on the edges of these hunting parties, watching from a distance before disappearing back into the woods without saying a word. Martha Sullivan, who ran the only boarding house in Elhorn Valley, wrote in her diary that travelers sometimes heard strange sounds coming from Widow's Ridge at night. She said the sounds were not animal or human, but somehow both. People mostly ignored these stories because they thought they were made up because they weren't used to the sounds of the mountains, or maybe they were just made up to make people laugh around the campfire at night. Sullivan's diary, which was found among her belongings after she died in 1923, is a great record of how people in the community felt about Blackwood, because her establishment was the main place for gossip and news. One entry from June 1896 says, "Mr. Harrison arrived from Nashville today, looking for guides for a botanical expedition." During dinner, the conversation turned to the hermit of Widow's Ridge. Rebecca Porter told how her husband's hunting dog refused to track in that direction, getting upset and whimpering when urged toward the ridge. This led Davis Miller to say that 3 of his sheep went missing last month after straying toward Blackwood's territory. He said he never told Constable Hargrove about this because he wasn't sure whether to blame wolves, bears, or something else. The table grew quiet at this suggestion, and the subject was changed. Our visitor seemed amused by these superstitious mountain folk, as he later called us, not understanding that our concerns arise not from imagination, but observation. In September 1898, a hunting party from Knoxville went into the area around Widow's Ridge, which changed things. The group, which included 3 men named Jonathan Price, Samuel Townsend, and Frederick Aldridge, never came back to their rooms in Elhorn Valley. The innkeeper, Martha Sullivan, called the local constable after 3 days without hearing from them. These 3 men were not new to adventure. Price was a banker and amateur naturalist who had written a number of articles about plants in the Appalachian region for scientific journals in the area. Townsend ran a successful hardware store in Knoxville and was known as a big sports fan who had hunted all over eastern Tennessee. Aldridge, who was 28 years old and the youngest of the 3, was a lawyer who worked for Price and had gone on several trips with him before. So, it wasn't easy to say that they went missing because of bad luck or not knowing how to handle the wilderness. The men wrote down their planned route in the guest register at Sullivan's boarding house before they left. This was a common practice that made it easy to organize search parties if travelers didn't come back on time. This entry, dated the 17th of September 1898, says that they planned a 5-day trip that would take them along the eastern ridge of the valley and then back along Stillwater Creek. This path would have taken them within 2 miles of Blackwood's cabin, but there is no evidence that they were planning to go into his territory. 7 men from the valley formed a search party, which was led by Constable William Hargrove. The Knox County Archives have a copy of the official report, which says that the search party found signs of the hunting party's camp about 4 miles northeast of Ezekiel's cabin. It looked like the camp had been left behind in a hurry. The men's rifles were still leaning against a tree, and there was still a half-cooked meal in a cast-iron pot. Constable Hargrove, a former Union Army scout who moved to the area after the Civil War, was known for being very organized in his work. In his report, he goes into great detail about the abandoned camp. The fire pit contained the remains of what appeared to be rabbit stew, now spoiled. 3 tin cups rested on a log beside the fire, one tipped on its side with contents spilled. The men's bedrolls were still arranged around the fire pit, though one had been partially pulled apart, suggesting the owner may have been in the process of packing when interrupted. A pocket watch belonging to Mr. Price was found hanging from a branch near his bedroll, still ticking. The most troubling find was a ripped piece of Mr. P. Townsend's jacket, which was identified by the unique brass buttons made by his own company. It was found caught on a thorny bush about 20 yards from the camp, in the direction of the ridge. The search went on for 2 days before the group found what they thought was evidence of a bear attack. Ripped clothes and other personal items spread out over a clearing about a mile from Ezekiel's house. However, Constable Hargrove's report says that there was no blood at the scene, even though the condition of the items found suggests that there was violence. Samuel Collins, who was part of the search party, later told Martha Sullivan that the scene felt wrong. In her diary, she writes that Samuel came back that night, shaken by what they found. He said that the clearing looked like it had been arranged rather than created by struggle. It was too neat, he told me, like someone had taken the time to place each torn shirt and boot just so. When I asked if he thought it might be Blackwood's doing, he grew pale and would say no more, except to say that they were going to visit the trapper's cabin tomorrow. I offered him whiskey, which he gratefully accepted. According to reports, Thomas Jenkins, a local guide who was helping the constable with the search, saw smoke coming from Ezekiel's cabin. Jenkins later said that the search party went up to the cabin to ask Ezekiel if he had seen any signs of the missing men. What happened next would be talked about and guessed about in the area for years to come. Jenkins said that as they got closer to the cabin, they could smell something very bad coming from it. Constable Hargrove knocked loudly on the door to let everyone know they were there, and why. Hargrove decided to go inside, after not getting an answer, but seeing movement inside. The official report says that the inside of Ezekiel's cabin was very well organized, almost to the point of being obsessive. There were jars of preserved foods, arranged by type and size. Every tool was in its right place, and every surface was clean. The search party found something very different in the cabin's root cellar. A bearskin rug hid the way to the cellar. Hargrove found a trap door with a complicated iron lock after moving this cover. The search party said they heard sounds coming from below that they described as scratching or whimpering. They broke the lock with an axe and then went down into the dark. Most official reports have left out what was found in that cellar. A personal letter from Constable Hargrove to the county sheriff, found in 1957 during a renovation of the courthouse in Knoxville, gives us some information though. Hargrove writes in this letter, "I have been the constable of this valley for 17 years and have seen the terrible ways that feuds, accidents, and acts of nature have taken human life. Nothing in my experience prepared me for what we found under Blackwood's cabin." The letter goes on to say, "The room had no windows and was only lit by our lanterns. The walls were completely covered in what I first thought were writing. But when I looked closer, I saw that these markings were tallies, thousands and thousands of precise vertical lines grouped in sets of 5, covering every available surface. In the center of this chamber stood a table of crude manufacture but sound construction. Upon this table lay various implements whose purpose I dare not speculate upon in written correspondence. What I can report is that we found evidence suggesting the missing hunting party had indeed encountered Blackwood, though no trace of the men themselves was discovered on the premises." The most disturbing part of Hargrove's letter comes near the end. It was Jenkins who first noticed the strange nature of the furs hanging from the rafters of this underground room. While most appeared to be common bear and deer hides, several displayed characteristics that caused immediate distress among our party. I ordered these particular specimens to be carefully removed and secured for examination by proper authorities. I must emphasize that this matter requires the utmost discretion. The implications, should certain suspicions be confirmed, would be beyond the capacity of our local jurisdiction to address adequately. The letter doesn't say anything directly about what these specimens are, but a different note found in Hargrove's belongings after he died in 1921 gives a disturbing hint. The note, which looks like it was written as a reminder, says, "Compare the markings on the unusual hides with the tattoo on Price's forearm as described by Mrs. Price. If they match, send a telegram to U.S. Marshal right away." Samuel Collins told a Knoxville newspaper reporter in 1899 more about the cellar than what was in official reports. The walls weren't just covered in tally marks. There were also diagrams, detailed drawings of what looked like human anatomy, but with notes I couldn't understand. Some of the markings looked like shorthand or code, and there were jars, dozens of them, with specimens preserved in some kind of solution. I recognized animal parts, mostly organs, but others. At this point, the reporter's notes say Collins refused to say anything more. The hunt for Ezekiel Blackwood started right away. People in Tennessee and nearby states passed around descriptions. The search for the man went on for almost 2 months, but it didn't find him. It was like the mountain had eaten him whole. Constable Hargrove set up 3 different trips deeper into the mountains because he thought Blackwood might have a second place to hide. These searches, which went all the way to the North Carolina border, found a few abandoned hunting camps that looked like they had been used recently, but there was no clear proof that they were connected to Blackwood. A fur trader who saw a man who looked like Blackwood near the Cumberland Gap in early October, about 3 weeks after the cellar was found, gave the best tip. This story says that the man was going north with a mule full of supplies. The man turned away when the trader tried to talk to him. There was a fresh wound across the back of his neck. The trader had heard about the manhunt but hadn't seen an official description. He only made the connection when he got back to Knoxville and read about the case in a newspaper. A station master in Bristol, Tennessee, said in November 1898 that he saw a man who looked like Ezekiel to get on a train to Washington, D.C. However, by the time the police were called and telegrams were sent, the train had already reached its destination, and there was no sign of the suspect. Reports from Washington newspapers say that police searched the train station and nearby neighborhoods very carefully but didn't find anyone who fit Blackwood's description. On the night in question, a hotel clerk remembered checking in a man with a long beard. The man had signed in as John Smith and paid for 1 night in advance. The next morning, when officers went to the room, it looked like someone had been there, but the guest had already left. The only thing they left behind was a small wooden bear carving that the clerk said looked like carvings sold in the Appalachian region. The case might have ended there, becoming a local legend, if not for something strange that happened in 1919 while a boarding house in Richmond, Virginia, was being fixed up. Workers found a sealed compartment in the wall of a room on the 2nd floor. There was a leather-bound journal in this room. The owner of the property gave the Virginia Historical Society the artifact because they knew it could be historically important. The Wayfarers' Rest boarding house in question was open from 1875 until 1918, when the owner died without any heirs. City records show that many guests have stayed in the room where the journal was found over the years, so it is impossible to say for sure who hid the document. The Richmond City Archives also have a guest registry that shows that in December 1898, a man who signed his name as E.B. stayed in the room for 2 weeks. These initials would later become important. The journal stayed in the catalog but was never looked at until 1943, when historian Margaret Caldwell started looking into patterns of migration after the Civil War. The journal she found had writings by a man who only called himself E.B. The entries were from 1878 to 1897, and the last one was written just 2 weeks before Ezekiel Blackwood went missing. Caldwell, a professor at the University of Virginia who studies Southern history after the Civil War, wasn't looking for information about the Blackwood case in particular. At first, she was interested in the journal because it might give her some ideas about how people moved around during Reconstruction. She didn't start to think that the document was connected to the famous Tennessee case until she had read it for a few days. She had come across that case while doing research on crime in Appalachia before. Caldwell's 1945 article in the Virginia Historical Quarterly about the journal showed that the story was much more complicated than just the story of a hermit in the mountains. Her research suggests that E.B. was probably a Confederate officer who had been trained as a doctor before the war. After the Confederacy lost, he apparently ran away to the west instead of giving up. He ended up in Colorado Territory around 1870. The early entries in the journal show that the man is having a hard time dealing with the mental effects of losing. E.B. writes about how humiliating it is to be subjugated and how important it is to make a new identity that isn't tainted by failure. Caldwell's analysis says that these passages show a deep shift in responsibility, with E.B. blaming outside forces for his situation instead of accepting that the Confederacy lost because of military and economic facts. The journal entries say that E.B. first became interested in what he called the fortitude of the human animal while he was in Colorado. The first entries make it seem like this interest was more academic, maybe because he was a doctor. E.B. writes about how miners and frontiersmen were able to survive in very harsh conditions, and he does so with a clinical detachment. One entry from March 1872 says, "Today I saw a fascinating demonstration of endurance. A miner trapped under fallen timber for 6 hours was finally freed." Despite having serious injuries to his lower body, he stayed conscious and even tried to help with his own rescue. "When I examined him, I saw that his pulse stayed remarkably steady throughout the ordeal." What mechanism in the human body allows for such stability in the face of trauma? Is it just physiological? Or does the will play a role? These questions need more study. However, the tone of the entries changes a lot by 1875. E.B. starts to talk about tests that are meant to see how far people can push themselves. The particulars of these experiments are never made clear, but the journal has a lot of references to subjects and specimens, as well as detailed notes on the length of time, how the subjects reacted to stimuli, and other physiological observations. Caldwell's analysis highlights a particularly concerning entry from November 1875. Subject C exhibited extraordinary resilience, enduring the cold water immersion protocol for nearly double the duration of preceding subjects. Upon subsequent inquiry, he disclosed a history of near drowning in his youth. This suggests that prior exposure to certain stressors may establish a form of physiological memory. Tomorrow, I will assess whether this adaptation applies to other types of environmental stress. The journal does not explain how these subjects were chosen or if they agreed to take part in the experiments. During this time, however, Denver newspapers had a lot of stories about prospectors and drifters who went missing from mining camps, which could mean there was a link. The most telling entry, dated July 1883, says, "I have decided that I need to be alone and have consistent access to subjects in order to make progress. The remote areas of eastern Tennessee may be suitable. The mountainous terrain offers privacy, and the settlements are so isolated that there should be a steady supply of suitable specimens. I leave tomorrow." This date is exactly when Ezekiel Blackwood arrived in Elhorn Valley. Caldwell's research strongly suggests that E.B. and Blackwood were the same person, a troubled person who turned the lonely mountains of Tennessee into his own lab. The last entry in the journal, dated the 30th of August 1898, shows that Blackwood knew that people were paying attention to what he was doing. Unwelcome visitors today. Their questions about recent disappearances suggest increased scrutiny. Perhaps it is time to conclude this phase of my work. I have accumulated sufficient data from this environment. There are other remote locations where my studies might continue uninterrupted. Caldwell's study of the journal took her to archives in Colorado, where she found records of a Dr. Elias Blackwood, who had been a field surgeon in the Confederate Army. Military records show that this Blackwood studied medicine at the University of Virginia before the war and was known for his work on how to manage pain during field amputations. After the Confederates gave up, Dr. Blackwood was listed as whereabouts unknown because he had never officially given up with his unit. A photo of Dr. Blackwood from 1862, kept in a Confederate military archive, shows a man of about 30 years old with clean-shaven skin and the same unnaturally pale eyes that people in Elhorn Valley talked about. When Caldwell showed this picture to older people who knew Ezekiel Blackwood, 2 of them were sure it was the same person, even though a lot of time had passed and he had grown a famous beard. What happened to Ezekiel Blackwood after he escaped from Tennessee is still one of the biggest mysteries in the case. Over the next 20 years, there were reports of him being seen in places as different as New Orleans, St. Louis, and even San Francisco. But none of these sightings were ever proven to be true. A police report from 1,901 inches, New Orleans talks about an interview with a dock worker who said he saw a man who looked like Blackwood get on a ship going to South America. The dock worker, who had previously worked as a guide in the Tennessee mountains, said he knew the man even though he tried to hide his identity by shaving his beard and wearing tinted glasses. The police looked into it, but they couldn't find any record of a passenger who fit the description on the ship's manifest. A doctor in St. Louis said he treated a patient in 1903 who had an infected wound and needed help. The doctor noticed strange scars on the man's forearms during the exam. They looked like precise tally marks, which are similar to those seen in the Blackwood case. The patient got upset and left without finishing treatment when the doctor asked about the marks. After reading about the Blackwood case in a medical journal, the doctor told the authorities about the incident, but they were unable to find the patient. In 1905, a doctor in Baltimore said he had treated a patient whose description and behavior were very similar to Blackwood's. This was the most believable lead. The doctor wrote in his notes that the patient said he was a professor of anthropology who had lived with native tribes for years to learn about their customs. It is said that the man got angry and left without finishing his treatment when asked about his background. We were unable to find this person. Dr. Harold Mitchell, the Baltimore physician in question, kept detailed notes of his interaction with the patient, who had introduced himself as Professor Edward Brighton. Mitchell's records, donated to the Johns Hopkins Medical Archives in 1930, describe Brighton as a man of approximately 60 years, tall and lean, with the weathered complexion of one who has spent considerable time outdoors. Despite his rough appearance, his speech was refined, and his knowledge of anatomy extensive. He sought treatment for what he described as recurrent fevers, but refused standard examination procedures. When I inquired about the unusual scarification visible on his forearms and the back of his neck, he claimed they were ritualistic markings acquired during his fieldwork with a tribe in the Amazon basin. However, the precision of these markings was inconsistent with tribal practices I have observed in anthropological literature. Mitchell's notes go on. What made me suspicious was his strange interest in my medical equipment, especially my collection of surgical instruments. He asked me a lot of questions about how to preserve tissue and whether I had ever done experiments on human endurance. When I told him I was worried about the nature of his questions, he suddenly changed his mind. He packed up and left, leaving payment but no forwarding address. Later, I noticed that a small scalpel was missing from my instrument case. Joseph Miller, who used to live in Elhorn Valley, said he saw Blackwood on a street in Philadelphia in 1912. Miller, who had been there when Blackwood's cabin was searched, said that the man recognized him right away and ran away before Miller could call the police. When the police got there to look into it, the suspect was nowhere to be found. Miller's account, which he gave to the Philadelphia police and then sent to the Tennessee authorities, paints a clear picture of the meeting. I was walking along Market Street when I saw a man looking at books at a vendor's stall. He was clean-shaven and dressed like a gentleman, but I recognized the way his shoulders were set and the strange intensity of his pale eyes. When our eyes met, we both knew who we were. He dropped the book he had been holding and quickly moved into the crowd. I chased him for several blocks but lost sight of him near the railway station. I am sure it was Blackwood. Older for sure, but unmistakable to someone who had seen what I saw in that cellar. The last believable sighting happened in 1921, when a train porter in Chicago said he helped an old man whose looks and strange accent reminded him of descriptions of Blackwood that had been in newspapers years before. The man was going by the name Edward Bennett and had papers that showed he was a retired professor from a university in England. Authorities looked into it but couldn't find any record of an Edward Bennett at any English school that fit the description given. William Johnson, the porter, gave a statement to the Chicago police, who then sent it to the federal government, which still has a file on the Blackwood case. Johnson's statement reads, "The gentleman appeared to be in his 72nd, though he moved with the deliberation of someone much older. He required assistance with his luggage, which consisted of 3 large trunks that were unusually heavy. When I commented on their weight, he informed me they contained research materials accumulated over a lifetime of study. What struck me most was his manner of speech, precise and formal, yet with an accent that shifted throughout our conversation, as though he were accustomed to disguising his natural voice. As I helped him into his compartment, I noticed his hands were marked with scars, and when he removed his gloves, I observed unusual markings on his wrists, like rows of small, precise cuts that had healed into white lines. If these reports are true, Ezekiel Blackwood was able to stay free for more than 20 years after his crimes in Tennessee. But even if he got away with it in court, evidence shows that fate may have caught up with him in a different way. An archivist at the Cook County Medical Examiner's Office in Chicago found records from 1923 describing a John Doe who had been found dead in a boarding house while they were cataloging unidentified remains in 10%. 1964. The man, who was thought to be in his 70 seconds, had no ID on him and died of what seemed to be natural causes. What caught the archivist's eye was a note about strange scars on the dead person's forearms and chest that looked like perfectly drawn tally marks. This description is very similar to the markings that were found in Blackwood's cellar. The medical examiner's report also said that the man had a small leather-bound notebook with what looked like coded entries and drawings of the body. This made the case even more interesting. Sadly, this notebook was not saved, so we don't know what was in it. The medical examiner's report, which was found again during the cataloging project in 1964, has a lot of information that makes the link to Blackwood stronger. People said the dead man was about 80 to 85 years old, 6'1" tall, and had a frame that made him look very strong when he was younger. The body shows signs of many old injuries, such as what looks like a bullet wound to the left shoulder and a fracture of the right radius that hasn't healed well. A dental exam shows that the deceased had high-quality gold dental work done, which was common in the 1870 seconds and 1880 seconds. This suggests that he had good medical care in the past. The report goes on to say that the most unusual thing about the deceased is the extensive scarification on the forearms, chest, and upper back. These marks are made up of perfectly straight vertical lines that are grouped in fives to make a tally pattern. It looks like the person who did the scarification did it to themselves over a long period of time. Some of the marks look very old, while others look like they were made recently. The pattern stays the same all the way through, which suggests that it was made for a ritual or to keep records. There are about 2,700 different tallies in all of the markings. If this man was Ezekiel Blackwood, it means that his obsession with documenting his experiments eventually led him to mark his own body, possibly as his mental health got worse with age. The idea that his last specimen was himself adds a final creepy twist to an already creepy case. The report ends with a note saying that attempts to identify the dead person through fingerprints and missing persons records had failed. The body was buried in a pauper's grave at the county's expense. The grave's location in Chicago's Graceland Cemetery was simply recorded as Plot 237, Section C. It was an unmarked burial that would have remained anonymous if the archivist hadn't made the connection to the Tennessee case 40 years later. We still don't know exactly what happened in Ezekiel Blackwood's cabin. The 3 hunters who went missing in 1898 were never found, but most historians agree that they were victims of Blackwood's disturbed experiments. Similarly, we can only guess at the full extent of Blackwood's activities during his 15 years in the Tennessee mountains, since many travelers who went missing in the area during that time were simply assumed to have fallen victim to the natural dangers of the mountains. Local records from Elhorn Valley and nearby towns show that at least 17 people went missing between 1883 and 1898, and the cases were never solved. Some of these were probably due to natural causes, like flash floods, animal attacks, or accidents in dangerous terrain. However, it's hard to ignore the fact that the number of missing persons reports went up after Blackwood arrived. What's even more interesting is that the number of missing persons reports dropped dramatically after Blackwood left, almost immediately returning to pre-1883 levels. Thomas Weller's store ledger provides indirect evidence of Blackwood's activities. Entries show a consistent pattern of purchases that, in retrospect, appear suspicious. Unusual quantities of salt, useful for preservation, alcohol, a common preservative for biological specimens, and specialized tools whose purpose in a trapper's cabin would be questionable. One entry from 1891 notes that Blackwood Special ordered 6 glass specimen jars with airtight seals through a catalog, explaining they were for preserving rare botanical samples. It is clear from the evidence that Ezekiel Blackwood turned a remote mountain cabin into a place of methodical terror. This could have been because of trauma from his time in the war, a mental illness he was born with, or a combination of the two. His case is a disturbing example of how isolation and privacy, which were two of the things that drew settlers to America's frontier regions, could also hide darkness beyond imagination. Constable Hargrove ordered the cabin to be burned down after the evidence was taken away. After that, locals stayed away from the site, and within a few years, the forest had taken back the clearing where it used to be. By 1920, according to local accounts, there was no sign of Ezekiel Blackwood's old home. Hargrove's official report said that he burned the building down for public health reasons because of the unsanitary conditions found in the cellar. However, a private letter to the county sheriff, which is in the same archival collection as his earlier letters, suggests a different reason. I have ordered the destruction of the structure to prevent it from becoming an object of morbid fascination. People from nearby towns who are curious have already tried to visit the site. Also, the wood in that place seems to have something unhealthy about it. The men who helped get rid of the evidence didn't want to go back to the scene because they said they felt like they were being watched. I think this is just natural unease after what we found, but I don't see any reason to keep a structure that doesn't serve any useful purpose. On the 15th of October 1898, Hargrove oversaw the burning, and several people from the community were there to see it. A newspaper article in the Knoxville Journal the next day said that the fire could be seen for miles and burned with unusual intensity, even though it had rained recently. Some people believed that the strange things that had happened inside were to blame, but a more logical explanation is that the many preserved specimens and chemicals found in the cellar made the fire burn more strongly. But the case's legacy lived on in the memories of people in the area for decades. After the discoveries of 1898, travelers were warned not to go into some parts of the mountains alone. Parents warned their kids about the dangers of talking to strangers, and, throughout the early 20th century, people living near Elhorn Valley reported finding tally marks carved into trees deep in the forest, marks that no one would claim responsibility for making. Several sources, including a 1927 survey by the Tennessee Forestry Service, have documented these tree markings. They look just like the ones Blackwood described in his cellar, precise vertical lines arranged in groups of 5. Most of them were found within 10 miles of the old cabin site, but some were found as far away as 20 miles, which suggests that Blackwood's territory was much bigger than people thought at first. It's not clear if Blackwood made these markings himself or if they were made by people who were inspired by the case, which is becoming more and more famous. As part of a project to record Appalachian oral traditions, folklorist Harold Dunham interviewed elderly people in the area in 1952. One of the people he talked to, Abigail Jenkins, was the daughter of Thomas Jenkins, who had been part of the original search party. Abigail said that her father was never the same after what he saw in Blackwood's cellar. He wouldn't talk about the details, but he would often wake up in the middle of the night and talk about the marks and the things hanging from the rafters. In the American Folklore Collection at the Library of Congress, there is an interview with Abigail Jenkins that includes this scary story. Daddy would never tell us exactly what they found in that cellar. He said it wasn't fit for decent people to know. But when the weather got cold and his joints hurt, he would drink too much whiskey. He would sit by the fire and stare into the flames, mumbling about the collection and the specimens. One time, when I pushed him, he looked at me with tears in his eyes and said, "The worst part wasn't what we found, Abby. It was realizing that he had been living with us for 15 years, sitting in the store and nodding to people on the road, all while doing those things right under our feet. Wonder what might be going on right now, under some other floor, in some other quiet place." Dunham's research, published by the University of Tennessee Press in 1955, suggests that the Blackwood case fundamentally altered the character of Elhorn Valley. What had once been a close-knit community became increasingly fragmented as suspicion and fear took root. By 1910, many of the original families had relocated to more populated areas, and by 1930, Elhorn Valley had effectively ceased to exist as a distinct settlement. This decline is confirmed by census records. The 1880 census showed that 47 people lived in the Elhorn Valley area. By 1900, just 2 years after the Blackwood incident, this number had dropped to 38. The 1,910 census showed that only 22 people lived there, and by 1920, the area was no longer considered a separate community for census purposes. It had been absorbed into the larger Jefferson County rural designation. Martha Sullivan's diary gives us a look at this decline. An entry from June 1899 says, "Another family is leaving today. The Williamsons are going to Knoxville, where Mr. Williamson has found work at a textile mill. Mrs. Williamson told me that she hasn't been able to sleep well since the Blackwood incident. She always hears footsteps on the porch at night. I can't blame her." Business at the boarding house has almost stopped because word of the incident has spread among the usual hunting parties that might come. The valley's silence gets deeper with each person who leaves. Cherokee National Forest now covers the area where Ezekiel Blackwood used to do his horrible experiments. Hikers sometimes say they feel uneasy in certain parts of the woods, but these reports are probably more about what they know about the area's history than anything supernatural. Forest Service records show that visitors have reported finding strange markings on trees or rocks near the old Elhorn Valley settlement several times over the years. Rangers usually say these are either natural phenomena or modern visitors trying to keep the Blackwood legend alive. A historical researcher got a 1,997 internal memo through a Freedom of Information Act request that shows the service has a specific way of recording and looking into these kinds of reports. This suggests that the service is interested in any possible link to the historical case. The memo says, if visitors report finding tally mark carvings in Sector 7B, historical Elhorn Valley, rangers are told to take pictures of the markings, write down exact GPS coordinates, and send this information to the regional office. Visitors should never be told about the historical importance of these markings or how they might be related to the 1,898 case. The standard response should say that the markings are probably from recent activity and aren't important to history. The most tangible remnant of the Blackwood case is a small collection of items preserved in the Knox County Historical Society's archives. These include Constable Hargrove's badge, several pages from Thomas Weller's store ledger showing Blackwood's transactions, and a single bear trap said to have been recovered from Blackwood's property. The mysterious specimens that were taken from the cellar are missing. They were supposed to be sent to Washington, D.C. for examination, but there is no record of their arrival. According to Historical Society records, a U.S. Marshal named James Holloway was in charge of transporting them to the Smithsonian Institution, where experts in anatomy and anthropology would look at them. Holloway left Knoxville by train on the 20th of October, 1898, but never made it to Washington. An investigation found that he left the train during a scheduled stop in Roanoke, Virginia, apparently taking the specimens with him. He was never seen again, and the specimens also disappeared from the historical record. This disappearance led to its own set of theories and legends. Some people thought that Holloway, after looking more closely at the specimens during his journey, became upset by their nature and destroyed them. Others thought he might have been paid or forced to give them to Blackwood's associates. The most dramatic theory, put forward by a sensationalist newspaper in 1899, said that Holloway was somehow connected to Blackwood's activities and had made up his identity as a marshal to get the evidence. No matter what the truth is, the fact that both Holloway and the specimens went missing adds another layer of mystery to an already complicated story. It means that some parts of the Blackwood case will always be up for debate, existing in that gray area between real history and folklore. Margaret Caldwell should have the last word on the case. Her analysis of the Richmond Journal gave the best picture of Blackwood's troubled mind. In the last paragraph of her 1,945 article, she writes, "What makes the Blackwood case so disturbing is not just the nature of his apparent crimes, but the methodical, almost scientific way he went about them. There was no crazed killer acting on impulse. Instead, there was a planned mind carefully keeping track of his crimes. In this, we may see something more disturbing than madness: the ability of human intelligence, when not held back by morals, to turn our best qualities, patience, precision, and dedication, into tools of terrible evil." Caldwell's assessment touches on a theme that goes beyond the specific horrors of the Blackwood case to a more general philosophical question about human nature. It suggests that the ability to do evil is not caused by an outside force or supernatural influence, but by changing the very qualities that allow people to grow. Blackwood, who had medical training and used scientific methods, is a particularly scary example of this change, using the tools of healing and discovery for bad ends. The mountains keep their secrets well. After decades of research, we still don't know much about Ezekiel Blackwood. We may never know everything he did during those 15 years in Tennessee, and we can't be sure what happened to him in the end. What we do know is scary. Sometimes the most dangerous predators are those who seem like strange, solitary people on the edge of civilization, watching and waiting for human patience to run out. As development spreads into areas of America that were once very remote, it's worth thinking about what other secrets might be hidden beneath the forest floor, and what other signs of darkness might still be present in places where people are still light enough for terrible things to happen without being noticed. The story of the mountain man's secret reminds us that wilderness is dangerous not only because of nature, but also because it is in these isolated places that human nature, when bent toward darkness, can express itself in its most terrible ways. The last known photograph that might show Ezekiel Blackwood was found in 1968 while a photography studio in Knoxville was being renovated. The picture, which is from 1897, shows a group of men outside the Elhorn Valley trading post. In the background, partially hidden by shadow, stands a tall figure with a long beard. His face is turned away from the camera, as if he is trying to avoid being seen. It is not clear if this figure is Blackwood, but the way he is standing and the way he is described match what people said at the time. In 1972, forensic photography experts looked at the photograph, which is now kept in the Tennessee State Archives. They used the limited enhancement techniques that were available at the time. Their report said that the figure's stance suggested military bearing and that, despite the poor quality of the image, the subject seemed to be watching the photographer rather than the apparent focus of the gathering. The report ends with the following: the subject's positioning indicates a conscious attempt to remain in the periphery of the image while maintaining visual awareness of the proceeding's behavior, consistent with someone wishing to avoid direct documentation while offers, say, gathering information. Several Elhorn Valley residents testified that Blackwood didn't want to be photographed. This suggests that he was trying to hide his identity on purpose, and that Ezekiel Blackwood was a made-up name meant to hide a previous life. This theory is backed up by the fact that there are no records of anyone by that name before he showed up in Tennessee in 1883. Researchers are still trying to figure out whether Blackwood's time in Tennessee was the start, middle, or end of his fall into darkness. The journal found in Richmond suggests that his experiments started in Colorado, but how many other remote places might have been home to his brand of terror before or after his time in the Appalachian Mountains? It's also worth noting that between 1877 and 1882, just before Blackwood got to Tennessee, there were several disappearances in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia that were never solved. Similarly, between 1900 and 1905, after he left Elhorn Valley, there were a series of disappearances in the Ozarks of Arkansas. While there is no direct evidence linking these events to Blackwood, the pattern and method are very similar. Virginia state records show that 7 people went missing in the Blue Ridge region during this 5-year period. All of them were solitary travelers or hunters. In 2 cases, abandoned camps were found with conditions similar to those found at the Tennessee hunters' site. Meals left half-prepared, equipment arranged neatly. No signs of struggle, but also no signs of planned departure. The Arkansas cases are even more interesting. Between 1901 and 1905, 9 people went missing in a remote part of the Ozarks. In 3 of these cases, search parties found trees with tally marks that were exactly like those found with Blackwood. One case, reported by the Arkansas State Police in 1904, involved finding an empty cabin with a collection of strange tools and chemicals that the officer thought were used for medical or scientific purposes. The cabin's occupant, who had told neighbors he was Dr. Edward Burke, had left without warning just days before the first disappearance was reported. If we accept the theory that the unidentified body found in Chicago in 1923 was indeed Ezekiel Blackwood, then his story ended far from the mountains where his most well-known crimes happened. Maybe there is some justice in this conclusion. A man who so carefully documented the suffering of others ultimately died anonymously, with only a brief entry in a medical examiner's logbook marking his death. The coroner's final notes on the case say, "The deceased seems to have died of natural causes, specifically heart failure due to old age. There is no proof of violence or self-harm." Strange scars were found all over the torso and limbs. They look like they have been there for a long time and are not related to the person's death. Personal items included only clothes, a pocket watch that was old but well kept, and a notebook with coded entries. There were no identification documents found. Suggests that unclaimed remains be thrown away in a standard way. This clinical assessment is very different from the detailed records that Blackwood kept himself. This may be the last irony in a life that was defined by obsessive record-keeping. The Blackwood case may have the biggest effect on people because it shows how easily evil can work in places that society doesn't pay attention to. In our modern world of connectivity and surveillance, it's easy to think that such monsters could no longer exist without being found. But there are still remote areas, and determined people still find ways to avoid being watched. William Faulkner, a historian, once said, "The past is never dead. It's not even past." This is especially true for Ezekiel Blackwood. His cabin has long since turned to dust, and most of his victims are still unknown, but the methodical horror he brought to the Tennessee mountains still lives on in history books and local legends. For those who study the darker parts of American history, the Blackwood case is a reminder that the frontier experience, which is often romanticized in our national mythology, had its dark sides, places where the absence of social constraints revealed not the noble savage of Rousseau's imagination, but the potential for calculated cruelty that civilization, for all its flaws, helps to suppress. The clearing where Ezekiel Blackwood once lived and worked is now overgrown with trees. Hikers who pass through today would find no sign of the cabin or the horrors it held. Nature, which doesn't care about human suffering, has erased the physical evidence of what happened there. But in archives and memories, in nightmares and whispered stories, the mountain man's secret lives on. A warning about the darkness that can sometimes be found behind the eyes of people who choose to live away from other people.